Chapter 4. As we landed in Tel Aviv, the passengers erupted in applause. We had arrived at the Holy Land. My first reaction was to reach for the paper bag in front of me and vomit. I'm not a good traveler, and I couldn't wait to get off the plane and get some fresh air. What greeted me was something I could hardly describe, possibly the same feeling I got when opening the door to my grandparents' dishwasher. Total heat and humidity at the same time. It caught me off guard. Once inside the building, we were greeted by a small welcoming delegation. We were returning Jews. After thousands of years in the diaspora, we had returned to our homeland. We were handed small chocolates and bright red syrup to drink. Our parents were escorted to meet with the immigration department officials as well as with the rabbi. Despite it only being my dad who was Jewish, the rabbi declared all of us children to be kosher, according to biblical law, and my papers were stamped Jewish, whatever that meant. It was pitch black by the time we arrived at our new home on the hills north of Jerusalem. It was an absorption center, a place for returning Jews to acclimatize to their new country, learn Hebrew, absorb the culture, and all at no cost, at no expense. The absorption center was almost full. Russia had recently opened up its doors, and thousands of Jews were leaving the country for a new homeland. Ethiopian Jews were also leaving persecution and returning to the land of their forefathers. Our new community was practically a flat version of the Tower of Babel. However, we were viewed with suspicion. Word got out that my mother wasn't Jewish. The Russians and the Ethiopians seemed oblivious to this glaring evil in their midst. But not so the American Jews. They had left the tainted streets of New York behind to soak up the purity of the Holy Land. How dare this defiled woman ruin their experience? My poor mother had to settle 6 unhappy children into a new country while being snarled at by men wearing black coats and hats. This is until they realized she was quite a useful asset in times of need. One Friday evening, we heard a tap on the door. My mother answered and was surprised to find a highly Orthodox man outside. He had a black hat, black coat, side curls dangling down his pale face, and a scraggly beard. He kept looking away from my mother while indicating with his head that he wanted her to come with him. Such a bizarre scene to be confronted with. However, my mother reluctantly followed this mysterious man through the community we lived. She walked behind him, down our street, around the corner, along a footpath with a man constantly checking that she was walking far enough behind him, but still making sure she wasn't turning back. After a short time, they arrived at the center's main cluster of buildings. The man motioned with his head for my mother to come into the synagogue. Not just into the synagogue, but into the male section of the synagogue. How could this be? Why on earth would he want her there? They got to the entrance, and he kept nodding towards the wall. Over and over he nodded, not saying a word, not looking at her, just nodding. My mother thought the man might have lost his mind when she looked into the room and noticed how dark it was. All the men were ducking up and down with their head in their Bibles, as they usually do, but it would have been too dark for them to read the words. My mother had been beckoned to switch the light on. Someone had forgotten to turn it on before the Sabbath, and with no light they were unable to read their scriptures for the evening service. They needed a Gentile to flick the switch. Another event that stands out from our 2 years at the center was a few months later. My dad was unable to contain his joy at knowing Jesus was his own personal Lord and Savior. He had taken the opportunity on the bus back from Jerusalem, with the passengers next to him as a captive audience, to share the good news of the gospel. His voice, as it tended to do, got too loud, and he was overheard saying the unthinkable. My dad said that Jesus is the only path to salvation. Our community was in uproar. The religious men who lived in our area gathered together to find a solution. My sister happened to be walking past when she heard them chanting, their fists in the air, "Stone them! Stone them!" She rushed home to warn us, and was greeted by my dad pacing around the house, cursing the demons of death that had apparently arrived in the past few hours. Just as he had taught me to do when having nightmares as a child, my dad was calling out at the top of his voice for the blood of Jesus to protect us. This went on for hours. I wasn't sure what was scarier, neighbors who wanted to stone us, or my father screaming at the top of his lungs for the devil to be rebuked and the blood of Jesus to cover his family. My dad's moves were becoming increasingly more difficult to live with. He was struggling with the pressures of a new country. He was expected to learn the language and to work in a factory, a job that was provided for him as a new immigrant. He also felt that he had no control over his children, who were struggling with adjustments as much as he was. All I knew is that I ached for Sweden more than anything else. My mind was imploding with all the new languages I was being exposed to and all the things I was seeing that didn't make sense. I was expected to go to school and speak Hebrew, and I couldn't even speak English yet. My family was at breaking point. I genuinely thought my 14-year-old sister was going to kill herself. I had no one to talk to. I didn't even have a bike that I could escape with. It was an incredibly difficult time. I wanted to switch off, and I wanted to make it all stop. Between May and October, it doesn't rain in Jerusalem. It just gets drier and drier, and I longed for rain. My only mental escape was a 2-meter metal fence surrounding a local school. I trained myself to balance on the thin beam of metal, bit by bit, over and over. Eventually, I would be able to walk around the school one step at a time, slowly balancing and letting my thoughts drift away. This is how I processed everything taking place around me. The intensity of our home, the craving for Sweden, my isolation, the longing for rain. Words cannot explain the joy I felt when the first drops of rain for the season fell on the afternoon of my 11th birthday. Giant drops came out of the sky, and it felt as if they were falling just for me. The air felt alive and my lungs filled with the smell of rain. I ran outside, and with my arms stretched open, I let the rain drench every part of me. God hadn't forgotten my birthday. He had given me the perfect birthday gifts. It took a while for me to start feeling comfortable using English as my new language. I understood bits and pieces by now, but I couldn't quite grasp the full concepts. I heard that someone was going to come visit one day and that it was a bit of an event. My dad was busy stirring in the kitchen and there was a knock on the door. I looked up from reading my beloved comics to see 2 formal-looking men enter our home. They chatted with my dad, and then a lady stepped inside who smiled at me. Then the house seemed to fill up with a whole bunch of people who all just stood around in our tiny living room. The woman asked me to show her my bedroom. I pointed to my bed and tried to explain to her in my broken English why there was a sheet draped in the middle of the room on a string, but I didn't quite have the English words to explain that my older sister hated me so much that she needed a linen sheet to separate us from each other. The lady seemed to find it somewhat amusing and had me show her the rest of our miniature house. It didn't take long. A couple of photos were taken by a man who had lots of cameras. The crowd left and I went back to my comic books. Later that day, I asked my mother what all that was about. Oh, that was the Queen of Denmark. She was in Jerusalem and had heard there was a Swedish family who had immigrated, and she had asked to meet us. We also had an unexpected knock on the door, and 2 elderly couples stood outside with their arms full of baskets of goodies. We had been eating very basic food since we arrived in Israel, and our eyes lit up at the sight of cakes and chocolate boxes with tropical fruit. With tears in their eyes, our visitors explained how they had escaped from Germany 40 years earlier and had been given refuge in Sweden. They were thrilled to finally be able to show their gratitude and hugged us as if we were the ones who pulled them out of their small boats to safety. I didn't quite understand why they were so emotional and hugging my mother with such fervor. My parents had naively assumed that their kids would easily slot into local school and pick up the language straight away. Not so. I wasn't progressing in the slightest way with my Hebrew skills. The problem was not having a common language to begin with. My English was just too basic, and I also had no desire to learn Hebrew. I felt no connection to the kids in my class. I missed Yuya with an ache in my body. I missed our freedom, and I missed the connection we had. Not having a language to express myself with was agony. I would simply sit in silence. Easily a week would go past with me not saying anything to anyone at school. This went on for months. It was so bizarre to go from being in such a dynamic setting with Yuyu and her family, where I had such a specific role to play, to all of a sudden being invisible. I felt like this for 2 years. There were so many strange moments during those 2 years that highlighted how out of touch I was. There was Israel's Day of Independence, for example, where everyone at school had to dress up in blue and white. The teacher thought she had explained this to me when I showed up for the morning ceremony. However, I was the only student at the school wearing white pants and a blue top. It was meant to be the other way around. This was such a visual reminder that I had no clue as to what was going on. I had to line up with the rest of the school as they sang the national anthem, looking like the odd one out. And then there was sports day we had at school. I didn't know it was a sports day. I hadn't understood, but I still had to run even though I didn't have the right clothes or shoes. Surprisingly, I came first. Then, about a month later, I was taken to compete in a giant park in the center of Jerusalem for all the schools in the area. I naively arrived at my class as usual in the morning, but instead got marched to a bus by my teacher. I had no idea where I was going. Once arriving and seeing the crowds, I realized it must be a competition. Again, I wasn't wearing the right clothes or shoes. I was handed a number to pin to my shirt and then got pushed to the starting line. When the gun went off, the other runners began to sprint, so I followed. I didn't even know where I was going or how long for, so I made sure I had other runners in front of me. I still managed to take a wrong turn and run through a deep patch of grass. With bugs flying into my mouth, I kept running while coughing them up. It was a really big race, and I figured that as long as I had a few kids in front of me, I would be fine. I eventually crossed the finishing line, and I was still somewhat shell-shocked that I had just been in a race. I could have so easily run faster and possibly been one of the first to arrive, but my whole focus had just been to make sure I didn't get lost along the way. After 2 very long years of not making one friend, I was given a scholarship to the Anglican International School right in the middle of Jerusalem. I was so relieved. My English had now improved enough that I could have a basic conversation and feel someone understood. I longed to finally make friends. I was in the second semester of year 6, although I had done very little schooling up until now. Thankfully, my scholarship wasn't based on my academic performance. I'm pretty sure it was given to us for having the winning combination of being Jewish and Christian. There was only another couple of Jewish families at the school, and considering the building had initially been funded as a service to the Jewish people, they probably felt a bit of pressure to balance out the numbers. Though originally built as a hospital to serve the Jewish people, the school was now a haven for international families seeking English education in a Hebrew and Arabic-speaking country. It was a wonderful mix of children of diplomatic families, United Nations workers, missionaries, and wealthy Palestinians and Arabs. I loved it. My classmates were from Ethiopia, Ghana, the Philippines, Greece, Trinidad, Ecuador, Germany, and so on. My teachers, on the other hand, were an eccentric mix, mainly from England, as well as other English-speaking nations. I had zero interest in learning, but I loved being in a dynamic environment once again. By this stage, our family had moved out of the absorption center and into the middle of Jerusalem. It felt so good to be out of that stifling environment and have an apartment in the city. I even had my own room. It was actually a balcony that had been converted into a room, and it was freezing in winter, but I was thrilled. I finally had my own space and somewhere to retreat to. The intensity in the house was beyond breaking point. My father was raging more and more, and his temper terrified me. My brother Ezra triggered an anger in my father that I had never seen before. He became a wild animal, chasing Ezra around the apartment, moving furniture to reach him, and when he finally got his hands on him, he would beat him. I would lie on my bed and cry as I listened to my dad pounding my brother's body. For my dad, it was his godly duty to discipline his children. It went hand in hand with being the head of the house, and he saw nothing wrong with his reign of terror over us. I wanted to connect with my father. Despite the fear, I still wanted him to see me and to see that I was as valuable as my brothers. The only time I felt that my dad connected with me was when we discussed theological truths. My dad would sit on the couch for hours and read his Bible. He would cross his arms and have the Hebrew Bible in one hand, the English Bible in the other, and the dictionary on the armrest next to him. He would be totally zoned out from what was happening in our home. Sometimes I would go and sit next to him and ask him what he was reading. I would always be able to make a link or a connection to generate a conversation. I knew I was good at it, and I knew that my dad knew this. He wasn't teaching me, I was challenging him. Whatever insight he had, I had another take on it. Whatever truth he found, I would have yet another question or angle. I loved proving myself like this. I loved showing my dad that I had something to offer. Despite my body rapidly evolving into that of a woman, I was in fact just as powerful as the boys in the family. In fact, I knew that when it came to theology, I was the only child that could leave my dad in the dust. My dad seemed to like our theological connection, but not so my changing body. His eyes never went south of my chin. I was only a face to him, and I could feel his unease. I could sense how uncomfortable he was, but there was never anything said. It was during this time that I was finally making friends at school with my two favorites were Ramsey and Tarek, two boys in my class. They were best mates, and because Ramsey lived around the corner from me, it was a really easy friendship. We would take the bus home from school together and spend a lot of time chatting about friends and life. One day on the way home, Ramsey and Tarek were saying they were going to have a wrestling match to finally decide which one of them was in fact the stronger out of the two. There was a lot of debate on who owned this title, and today was going to be the day we found out the answer. A mattress was placed on the bedroom floor, and Ramsey and Tarek started their epic power struggle. After a long battle, Ramsey won. I decided I wanted to try and see if I could beat the champion. Ramsey and I stood face to face, and the moment Tarek yelled, "Go!" I bent down and I grabbed Ramsey's ankles and pulled him out from underneath him. He toppled. I had beaten the champion. I was elated, and I ran home and burst in the door to share the good news that I had beaten a boy in wrestling. I didn't need to match him in physical strength. I just had to be smarter. I was beaming. I then looked over at my dad. His nostrils had started to flare. Oh, this was a bad sign. My dad's nostrils were a way for us to see where he was at. As soon as the flaring started, we knew that something was about to erupt. My dad took me out on the balcony, and while trying to contain the volcano that was starting in his chest, he said in a voice filled with anger and disgust, "Veronica, I never want you to do that again. I do not want a child to come into this world unwanted." What? What on earth was he saying? Surely not. Surely he wasn't suggesting that I was doing something sexual. I was gutted. Absolutely gutted. My face was burning. I felt so misunderstood. How could my dad possibly think that of me? Me! I was the total tomboy, the girl who was more boy than girl and who hated the girlishness with everything in her. How could he not see that? I came away from that balcony feeling more shame than I'd ever felt before. Unfortunately, there was nothing I could do to stop the changes that were going on in my body. My breasts were growing at an enormous speed. Initially, I had tried to ignore them and tried not to think about the obvious things that were taking place. Sadly, there was no way I could deny that not only was my body changing, it was exploding. Within a very short period of time, I had these giant breasts, and they were only getting bigger and bigger, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. Instead, I bought 3 sweatshirts, along with some black leggings, and it was all I wore. It helped me hide. I was comfortable, and it was the best I could do, hiding my breast. Here I was, a blonde, blue-eyed, big-breasted Swedish tomboy. No matter how much I wanted to pretend my breasts away, I couldn't. I was getting yelled at from buses, and men bumped into me on purpose. Soldiers rubbed themselves on me while squeezed into full buses, and me not being able to move away. I had a shop owner chase down the street after me, begging me to come home with him. Apparently, he would look after me and love me. One day, when walking home from the city, absolutely lost in thought, I noticed that someone had been clearing their throat very close to me. It didn't really register until I felt a very weak tap on my shoulder. I turned around and faced a pale yeshiva student. He was wearing a skull cap. He had the spiral locks going down the sides of his white face, small round glasses, and a white shirt with the prayer tassels hanging out. He looked desperate, and he pleaded with me, "Please, fuck me. I will pay you whatever you want. Just fuck me." I refused to show him how shocked I was, and instead I took a deep breath, and in my strongest Israeli accent, I said in Hebrew, "I am Jewish." The look on his face, the sheer terror, he turned around and ran.